The summer of 1887 brought drought to the Dakota Territory, and, with it, a desperation that Samuel Mitchell had never known. His cattle ranch stretched across 2,000 acres of what would someday become South Dakota, but the grasslands that once fed his herds now cracked like broken pottery under an unforgiving sun. At 32, Sam had built his spread from nothing, arriving with little more than determination and a handful of silver dollars sewn into his coat lining. Now, as he stood on his porch watching dust devils dance across his barren fields, he realized that all his hard work might crumble to nothing if he didn't find help soon. The idea came to him during a sleepless night in July, when the heat made even the wooden walls of his cabin groan with expansion. He needed a wife, not for romance or companionship, though those would be welcome, but for survival. A woman could tend the vegetable garden that might feed them through the coming winter. She could preserve what little meat the weakening cattle could provide. Most importantly, she could help him manage the ranch hands who grew more restless with each passing day of failed grazing. Sam had tried courting locally, but the few unmarried women in Millbrook, the nearest town 40 miles east, had their pick of men. Why would they choose a struggling rancher when they could marry the banker's son or the merchant who sold dry goods? Besides, Sam knew what kind of woman he needed. Someone calm, practical, and unafraid of hard work. Someone who wouldn't faint at the sight of blood during cattle slaughter or complain about the isolation that came with frontier life. That's when he remembered the newspaper advertisements he'd seen in the Millbrook Herald. Mail-order brides had become common throughout the territories, matching practical men with practical women who understood that frontier marriages were partnerships built on necessity rather than fairy tale romance. Sam had always dismissed such arrangements as desperate, but now he wondered if desperation might be exactly what he needed. The next morning, he rode to town under a sky the color of hammered copper. The general store doubled as the post office, and Mrs. Henderson, the postmaster's wife, raised her eyebrows when Sam asked for writing materials. He'd never been much for correspondence, preferring to handle his business face-to-face or not at all. Writing to family back east, she asked, her curiosity barely concealed behind a motherly smile. Something like that, Sam replied, paying for the paper and ink without elaboration. Mrs. Henderson was kind enough, but news traveled fast in small towns, and he didn't want his personal business becoming the subject of Sunday dinner conversations. Back at his ranch, Sam sat at his kitchen table and stared at the blank paper for the better part of an hour. How would a man advertise for a wife? What qualities should he mention about himself? And what should he look for in return? He'd read other men's advertisements in the papers. Most seemed to focus on land ownership and financial stability, while requesting women who were God-fearing, hard-working, and of good character. Finally, Sam began to write. Established rancher in Dakota Territory seeks sensible woman for marriage. Must be willing to work hard and live simply. Ranch covers 2,000 acres with good prospects for growth. House is sturdy and comfortable. Prefer woman aged 20 to 28, able to cook, garden, and manage household. No previous marriage or scandal. Serious inquiries only. Write to Samuel Mitchell, care of Millbrook Post Office, Dakota Territory. He read it 3 times, crossed out good prospects for growth, and replaced it with steady income, then crossed that out too and wrote profitable operation. The lies came easier than he'd expected. The ranch wasn't profitable. Not anymore, but it could be again if the drought broke and the cattle market recovered. Sometimes a man had to present hope as fact, especially when his survival depended on it. The advertisement ran in newspapers across the eastern states for 6 weeks. Sam had chosen publications in Pennsylvania and Ohio, figuring that women in those areas would be familiar with farming life but ready for adventure. He specifically avoided the larger cities like New York or Boston, assuming that city women would be too delicate for frontier life. The first response arrived in late August, written in careful script on expensive paper. Miss Eleanor Whitman of Philadelphia described herself as 23 years of age, accomplished in all domestic arts, and eager to contribute to the building of our great nation's frontier. She mentioned her father's fabric business and her education at a young ladies' academy. Sam read the letter twice and set aside. Miss Whitman sounded exactly like the type of refined woman who would take one look at his drought-stricken ranch and demand the next train ticket back east. The second letter came from Ohio, written by a widow named Mrs. Catherine Brennan. She was 31 with 2 young children, looking for security and a father figure for her boys. Sam appreciated her honesty about the children, but he was barely managing to feed himself and his ranch hands. Adding a family to his responsibilities seemed like a recipe for disaster. Then came the third letter, postmarked from a small town in Pennsylvania that Sam had never heard of. The handwriting was bold and confident, quite different from the careful penmanship of the other correspondence. Mr. Mitchell, your advertisement caught my attention because you didn't promise paradise or make grand claims about easy living. I respect honesty in a man. My name is Clara O'Sullivan. I'm 25 years old, and I've been working my family's farm since I was 12. My father died 3 years ago, and my brother sold the land rather than let me continue running it. He said farming was no work for a woman, despite the fact that I kept the place profitable while he was off playing cards in town. I can plow a field, birth a calf, and shoot a rifle well enough to keep wolves away from the livestock. I can also bake bread, preserve vegetables, and sew clothes that won't fall apart after a week's wear. I'm not looking for romance or adventure. I'm looking for a place where hard work is appreciated and a woman's contributions are valued. If you're still seeking a wife and these qualities interest you, write back with details about your ranch and expectations. I'm not afraid of difficult conditions, but I won't be deceived by false promises. Respectfully, Miss Clara O'Sullivan. Sam read the letter 4 times before setting it down. Everything about it appealed to him. The practical tone, the obvious farming experience, even the slight edge of defiance when she mentioned her brother's attitude toward women farmers. This was exactly the type of woman he needed. Someone who understood that frontier life was about survival, not sentiment. That evening, he composed his reply by lamplight, choosing his words carefully. He described his ranch honestly, the good grazing land, the sturdy buildings, the current drought conditions. He mentioned the isolation, the hard winters, and the fact that the nearest neighbor lived 8 miles away. He explained that he was looking for a partner in building something lasting, not a decoration for his arm at church socials. I work from dawn until dark during good seasons and longer during bad ones, he wrote. I expect the same dedication from a wife. In return, I can offer security, respect, and a share in whatever success we build together. If these terms are acceptable, I can send money for train passage to Millbrook. The marriage ceremony could be arranged immediately upon your arrival. He mailed the letter the next morning and tried not to think about it as he went about his daily routine. The drought continued, and 2 of his older cattle died from the heat and lack of good water. He buried them in a draw beyond the main pasture, wondering how many more he'd lose before the weather broke. Clara's response arrived 3 weeks later, brief and to the point. Your terms are acceptable. I will arrive on the afternoon train September 22nd. I'll be wearing a blue dress and carrying a brown traveling case. Please arrange for the marriage ceremony the following morning. Send passage money to the address below. Sam stared at the letter, sudden uncertainty gripping him. In less than 10 days, a woman he'd never met would arrive expecting to marry him and share his life. What if she took one look at his struggling ranch and changed her mind? What if he'd misunderstood her character entirely? What if the practical partnership he envisioned turned into something more complicated? But then he looked out his window at the dying grassland and reminded himself why he'd started this process. He needed help, and Clara O'Sullivan seemed capable of providing it. Romance could wait, survival couldn't. He rode to town that afternoon and sent the money for her train ticket, along with a brief note confirming the arrangement. As he handed the envelope to Mrs. Henderson, she gave him a knowing smile. Finally, ready to settle down, Samuel, she asked. It's about time. A man shouldn't live alone out there on the prairie. Yes, ma'am, Sam replied, not bothering to explain that settling down was the last thing on his mind. He was gambling everything on a stranger's letter, hoping that necessity would be enough to build a marriage on. As he rode home under the vast Dakota sky, he wondered if Clara O'Sullivan was having similar doubts, or if she was as practical and unsentimental as her letter suggested. The days passed slowly as September 22nd approached. Sam found himself paying more attention to his appearance, trimming his beard, and washing his clothes more frequently than usual. He cleaned his cabin thoroughly, fixing a loose board on the porch and replacing a cracked window pane. These weren't romantic preparations, they were practical ones. A woman deserved to arrive at a well-maintained home, regardless of the circumstances that brought her there. On September 20th, he rode to Millbrook to make final arrangements. The minister, Reverend Thompson, agreed to perform the ceremony at 10 o'clock on September 23rd. The Reverend was a practical man himself, accustomed to frontier marriages that prioritize compatibility over courtship. "You sure about this, Sam?" he asked as they stood outside the small church. "Marriage is a serious undertaking, even under these circumstances." "I'm sure," Sam replied, though his confidence wavered slightly. "We both know what we're getting into. That's more than most couples can say." "Perhaps," the Reverend mused. "But knowing something in theory and living it in practice are different things entirely. You might want to give yourselves a few days to get acquainted before making it official." Sam shook his head. "She's coming here to marry me, not to court me. Prolonging things would just make it harder for both of us if we decide it won't work." The Reverend nodded reluctantly. "As you wish. I'll see you Sunday morning then." That night, Sam lay awake thinking about the woman who would soon share his name and his home. Clara O'Sullivan remained a mystery despite their correspondence. He knew she could farm and wasn't afraid of hard work. But what about her temperament? Was she quick to anger or slow to forgive? Did she laugh easily or find little humor in life? Would she resent him for the deception in his advertisement when she discovered that his profitable operation was actually struggling to survive? Morning came too quickly, bringing with it the day that would change his life forever. Sam dressed in his best shirt and jacket, holstered his revolver out of habit, and rode toward town to meet his bride. The September air carried the first hint of autumn, reminding him that winter would arrive whether his marriage succeeded or failed. Everything he'd worked for depended on the next few hours, and the woman stepping off the afternoon train for Pennsylvania. The afternoon train wheezed into Millbrook Station 43 minutes late, trailing black smoke and the smell of hot metal. Sam Mitchell stood on the wooden platform, his hands sweating despite the cool September breeze. He'd imagined this moment dozens of times over the past week, but now that it was happening, his mind went blank. What did a man say to a woman who'd traveled 1,500 miles to marry him? The train cars disgorged their passengers in small groups, traveling salesmen, farmers returning from business in the eastern cities, and a few families relocating to the territories. Sam scanned each face, looking for a woman in a blue dress carrying a brown traveling case. Then he saw her. Clara O'Sullivan was not what he'd expected, though he couldn't have said exactly what his expectations had been. She stood nearly as tall as most men, with auburn hair pinned severely back and green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her blue dress was practical rather than fashionable, made of sturdy fabric that wouldn't show dirt easily. She carried herself with the confident posture of someone accustomed to physical work, and when she spotted him, the only man on the platform wearing his best clothes and looking nervous, she walked directly toward him without hesitation. "Mr. Mitchell." Her voice carried a slight Irish accent, probably inherited from her parents rather than acquired through birth. "Yes, ma'am. Miss O'Sullivan, I presume." Sam removed his hat and immediately felt foolish for the formal gesture. They were past the point of polite courtship rituals. "I am." She set down her traveling case and extended her hand for a firm shake that surprised him with its strength. "You're exactly as I pictured you from your letters. Practical and honest." "I hope that's a compliment," Sam said, relaxing slightly. Her directness made conversation easier than he'd anticipated. It is. I've had enough experience with men who promise the moon and deliver nothing but hot air. Clara looked around the small station and the dusty main street beyond. This is smaller than I expected, but that's not necessarily bad. Small towns mean fewer complications and more honest dealings. Sam picked up her traveling case, noting its substantial weight. Whatever Clara had brought with her, she'd pack for a permanent stay. The wagon's just outside. It's about an hour's ride to the ranch. As they walked toward his buckboard, Clara asked practical questions about the town, the weather patterns, and the local economy. She didn't seem disappointed by Millbrook's modest size or worried about the isolation ahead. When they passed the general store, she noted the prices posted in the window and commented that supplies cost about 20% more than what she was used to paying in Pennsylvania. That's typical for frontier towns, Sam explained as he helped her onto the wagon seat. Everything has to be shipped in, which drives up costs. But we produce most of what we need on the ranch, so it's not too burdensome. The ride to his spread gave Sam his first real opportunity to observe his future wife. Clara sat straight back beside him, her eyes constantly moving as she studied the landscape. She asked about soil quality, water sources, and the types of crops that grew well in the region. When they passed a neighbor's failed wheat field, she correctly identified the problem as poor drainage without being told. "You weren't exaggerating about your farming experience," Sam observed. "I never exaggerate about work," Clara replied. "It's the one thing in life that doesn't benefit from embellishment. Either you can do something well or you can't." They crested a low hill, and Sam's ranch came into view. He watched Clara's face carefully, trying to gauge her reaction to what would soon be her home. The main house was a solid log structure with a stone foundation and a wide front porch. The barn and outbuildings were well constructed but showed signs of deferred maintenance. Most telling was the state of the pastures, brown and sparse where they should have been green and thick. Clara studied the scene for a long moment before speaking. "Drought's been hard on you." "Very hard," Sam admitted. "I won't pretend otherwise. This year's been the worst in memory. But the bones of the place are good," Clara continued. "Strong buildings, sensible layout, good protection from a wind. When the rains come back, this could be profitable again." "If the rains come back," Sam said. Clara turned to look at him directly. "They will. Droughts don't last forever, and this land has the look of good grazing country. The question is whether you can hold on long enough to see the recovery." Her confidence surprised him. Most people who saw his current situation focused on the problems rather than the potential. "What makes you so certain?" "Experience," Clara said simply. "I've seen bad years before, and I've seen how quickly things can turn around when conditions improve. The key is not to panic and sell everything cheap when times are hard." As they pulled up to the house, Sam's hired hands emerged from the barn to get their first look at the woman who would soon be the lady of the ranch. He employed 3 men full-time. Miguel Santos, a vaquero from Texas who understood cattle better than anyone Sam had ever met. Hans Mueller, a German immigrant who could fix anything mechanical. And Tommy Chun, a young Chinese man whose family had originally come west to work on the railroad, but stayed to try farming. Sam had worried about how Clara would react to such a diverse crew, given that many Easterners harbored prejudices against foreigners and non-whites. But Clara stepped down from the wagon and greeted each man with the same respectful nod she'd given Sam, evaluating them with the practical eye of someone who cared more about competence than ancestry. "Miguel tells me you're the best stock handler in the territory," she said after Sam made introductions. "That's valuable expertise to have during difficult times." Miguel, who rarely spoke to women beyond basic politeness, found himself explaining his theories about drought management and cattle nutrition. Clara listened intently, asking intelligent questions that demonstrated her understanding of livestock care. By the time the conversation ended, Miguel was looking at her with something approaching respect, a reaction that Sam had never seen him have toward any woman. The tour of the ranch took 2 hours, with Clara insisting on seeing everything from the main house to the most distant water source. She examined the kitchen garden with the attention of a military inspector, noting which vegetables had survived the drought and which varieties might be better suited to the local climate. In the barn, she ran her hands along the walls and support beams, testing for structural weakness. She even climbed into the hayloft to check the roof for leaks. "You maintain your equipment well," she observed as they finished the tour. "That speaks well of your character. A man who takes care of his tools will usually take care of his obligations." They returned to the house as the sun touched the horizon, painting the drought-stressed landscape in shades of gold and amber. Clara stood on the front porch, looking out over what would soon be her domain, and Sam tried to read her thoughts. Was she having second thoughts? Did the reality of frontier life look different for what she'd imagined? "The ceremony is tomorrow morning," he said, breaking the silence. "But if you've changed your mind after seeing the place, I'll understand. I can arrange for your return passage east." Clara turned to face him, her green eyes steady and unwavering. "Have you changed your mind, Mr. Mitchell?" "No," Sam replied immediately. "You're exactly what I hoped for in a wife, practical, experienced, and unafraid of hard work. Then why would I change mine? I came here to marry a rancher and help build something lasting. Nothing I've seen today has changed that goal." Clara paused, then added with the hint of a smile, "Though I do think we should discuss some improvements to the operation once we're properly wed." That evening, Clara insisted on cooking dinner despite Sam's protest that she was a guest until tomorrow's ceremony. She explored his kitchen with the efficiency of a general surveying a battlefield, quickly identifying what supplies he had and what meals could be prepared with them. Within an hour, she produced a hearty stew from ingredients that Sam would have struggled to turn into anything edible. Over dinner, they discussed the practical details of their upcoming marriage. Clara would take his name, of course, but she wanted to maintain some independence in managing the household budget and making decisions about domestic matters. Sam would remain in charge of the ranch operations, but she expected to be consulted on major decisions that affected their joint welfare. "I'm not looking to be an ornament in your parlor," Clara said frankly. "I'm here to be a partner in building this place up. That means having a voice in how it's run." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Sam assured her. "I need someone who can think for herself, not someone who will need constant guidance." They agreed that Clara would handle all domestic responsibilities, cooking, cleaning, gardening, and food preservation, while Sam focused on the cattle, land management, and dealings with neighboring ranchers. Both would contribute to major decisions about buying livestock, expanding operations, or making significant changes to the property. As the evening wound down, an awkward moment arose when it came time to retire. They were not yet married, which meant separate sleeping arrangements, but Sam's cabin had only one bedroom. He'd planned to sleep in the barn, giving Clara privacy in the house, but she dismissed the idea as impractical. "I'll take the settee in the front room," Clara decided. "It's more appropriate than displacing you from your own bed for the sake of proprieties that we'll abandon tomorrow anyway." Her matter-of-fact approach to their unusual situation impressed Sam. Clara seemed determined to treat their arrangement as a business partnership that happened to involve marriage, rather than a romantic situation complicated by practical concerns. It was exactly what he'd hoped for, though he found himself wondering if he might be missing something important by focusing so exclusively on the practical aspects. That night, as he lay in his bed listening to Clara moving quietly around the front room, Sam reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. 24 hours ago, he'd been a bachelor facing potential bankruptcy. Now he was about to marry a woman who might save his ranch through her practical skills and strong character. It wasn't the kind of love story that people wrote songs about, but it felt honest and sustainable in ways that romantic passion often wasn't. Morning came clear and cool, with the first real promise of autumn in the air. Sam woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, realizing that Clara had risen early to prepare breakfast. When he emerged from his bedroom, he found her already dressed in a simple but elegant dress of dark green wool, obviously her best outfit, saved for special occasions. "Good morning," she said, as if they'd been sharing breakfast for years rather than preparing for their wedding day. "I thought you might appreciate a good meal before we head to town." The breakfast was excellent, but Sam found himself too nervous to eat much. The reality of what he was about to do, marry a virtual stranger based on a few letters and one day's acquaintance, suddenly seemed overwhelming. What if they discovered fundamental incompatibilities after it was too late to change course? What if Clara's practical exterior hid expectations that he couldn't meet? "You're having second thoughts," Clara observed, setting down her coffee cup and studying his face. "Not exactly," Sam said. "More like concerns about whether we're doing this the right way." "Is there a right way to marry a stranger?" Clara asked. "We're both adults making a practical decision based on honest information. That's more than many couples can claim, even after months of courtship. But what if we don't get along? What if this partnership we're planning doesn't work out?" Clara was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. "Then we'll deal with that situation when and if it arises. But I'll tell you this, Mr. Mitchell. I didn't travel 1,500 miles to fail at something I set my mind to. I intend to make this marriage work through sheer determination, if necessary." Her words reassured Sam more than any romantic declaration could have. Clara wasn't entering this union with unrealistic expectations or naive hopes. She was approaching it like any other challenge in her life, with clear eyes, practical planning, and stubborn determination to succeed. An hour later, they rode to town for the wedding ceremony. Clara had pinned her hair in an elaborate style that softened her practical appearance, and she wore a small gold locket that had probably belonged to her mother. Sam had shaved carefully and worn his best suit, the one he'd bought for church services and business meetings. The ceremony itself was brief and businesslike, conducted by Reverend Thompson in his small wooden church with Miguel, Hans, and Tommy serving as witnesses. Clara's responses were clear and confident, while Sam found himself stumbling slightly over the traditional vows. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Clara extended her hand for another firm handshake, a gesture that made Sam smile despite his nervousness. "Well, Mrs. Mitchell," Sam said as they signed a marriage register, "I suppose we're officially partners now." "Indeed we are, Mr. Mitchell," Clara replied. "Now let's go home and get to work." The first month of marriage passed like a carefully choreographed dance between two people learning each other's rhythms. Clara Mitchell proved to be everything she claimed in her letters and more. She rose before dawn to tend the kitchen garden, somehow coaxing vegetables from soil that Sam had written off as too dry to support anything green. Her meals transformed the simple ingredients available on the ranch into hearty fare that kept the men's spirits up despite the continuing drought. But it was Clara's way with the ranch hands that truly surprised Sam. Within 2 weeks, she'd reorganized their work schedules to maximize efficiency during the cooler morning and evening hours. She treated Miguel's expertise with livestock as seriously as any veterinarian's, often seeking his advice on treating sick cattle. When Hans mentioned that his wife back in Germany used to make a particular type of preserves, Clara asked for the recipe and soon had jars of preserved vegetables that would help feed them through the winter. Most remarkably, she seemed to understand Tommy Chen's position as the only Chinese man in a predominantly white community. Clara made a point of asking about his family's farming methods in China, incorporating some of his suggestions into her garden planning. Tommy, who usually kept to himself outside of work duties, began lingering after meals to discuss agricultural techniques with the ranch's new mistress. "She's good for this place," Miguel told Sam one evening as they watched Clara examining a sick calf. "The men work harder when they feel respected, and she makes them feel that way." Sam had to agree. The atmosphere on the ranch had changed subtly, but significantly since Clara's arrival. There was less grumbling about the hard conditions, and more focus on making do with what they had. Even the cattle seemed calmer around Clara, who approached them with confident movements that didn't spook the animals. But the real test of Clara's character came in October, when Jake Morrison rode over from the neighboring spread with an offer that would have tempted a desperate man. Morrison was a successful rancher who'd weathered the drought better than most, partly through smart planning and partly through ruthless business practices. He'd been buying up struggling ranches at cut-rate prices, expanding his holdings while his neighbors faced bankruptcy. "Sam," Morrison said as he dismounted near the house, "I hear congratulations are in order. Married yourself a mail-order bride, I'm told." "Clara's my wife," Sam replied carefully. Morrison's tone suggested this wasn't a social call. "Good for you. Man needs a woman to keep house properly." Morrison's eyes swept over the ranch, noting the signs of continued struggle. "Speaking of which, I got a proposition that might interest you both." Clara emerged from the house at that moment, having heard voices from inside. She wore a simple work dress and had flour on her hand from bread making, but she carried herself with dignity as she joined the conversation. "Mrs. Mitchell." Morrison tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Welcome to the territory. I trust you're finding frontier life educational." "I'm finding it exactly what I expected," Clara replied evenly. "Hard work and honest living." Morrison smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's admirable, ma'am. But sometimes hard work isn't enough. Sometimes a man needs to make difficult decisions for the good of his family." "What kind of proposition?" Sam asked, though he suspected he already knew. "I'm prepared to offer you $1,200 for your land and remaining cattle," Morrison said. "Cash money, enough to set yourselves up somewhere else. Maybe in town where your wife could open a boarding house or some such feminine enterprise." The offer was more generous than Sam had expected, though still well below what the ranch would be worth in normal times. $1,200 would indeed allow them to start over somewhere else, perhaps in a business that wouldn't depend on the vagaries of weather and cattle prices. Sam glanced at Clara, trying to gauge her reaction. This was exactly the kind of major decision they'd agreed to make together, but they'd been married less than 2 months. How could he ask her opinion about selling the home and future she'd just committed to? "That's quite an offer, Mr. Morrison," Clara said before Sam could respond. "What makes you think we'd be interested in selling?" Morrison gestured toward the brown pastures and the thin cattle scattered across them. "No offense, ma'am, but any fool can see this place is struggling. Your husband's a good man, but he's fighting a losing battle. I'm offering him a way out with his dignity intact." "I see," Clara said thoughtfully. "And what would you do with our land if we sold?" "Expand my operation. I've got better access to water, so I can keep more cattle alive during dry spells. Your pastures would..." "He's already mortgaged to the hilt, and winter's coming. How many cattle do you think will survive another bad year?" This was news to Sam. He hadn't told Clara about the mortgage on the ranch, taken out 2 years earlier to buy additional breeding stock. Morrison's mention of it in front of his wife felt like a deliberate humiliation, designed to make the sale seem inevitable. Clara turned to look at Sam, her green eyes steady and unreadable. "Is that true? About the mortgage?" "Yes," Sam admitted, feeling heat rise in his cheeks. "I should have mentioned it before we married. I took out a loan to expand the herd, back when things looked promising." "How much do you owe, and when is it due?" Clara's voice remained calm, but Sam could hear the steel underneath. $800, due in January, Sam said quietly. Morrison nodded sympathetically. "You see the problem, Mrs. Mitchell. Even if your husband could scrape together $800, he'd still be left with a ranch that can't support itself. My offer would clear the debt and leave you with $400 to start fresh somewhere else." Clara was quiet for a long moment, studying Morrison with the same careful attention she'd given Sam's ranch buildings. Finally, she spoke. "Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your generous offer, but we won't be selling." Morrison's eyebrows rose. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand the situation." "I understand it perfectly," Clara interrupted. "You want to buy our land cheap during a temporary crisis, then profit from it when conditions improve. It's a common enough business practice, but that doesn't make it attractive to the seller. Now see here." Morrison's facade of friendliness began to slip. "I'm trying to help your husband out of a bad situation. If you're too proud to accept reasonable assistance, If we were seeking assistance, Mr. Morrison, we'd ask for it, Clara said firmly. But we're not. We're perfectly capable of managing our own affairs. Morrison looked back and forth between Sam and Clara, clearly frustrated by their rejection of what he considered a generous offer. Fine, he said finally, but when winter comes and you're facing foreclosure, don't expect me to be so generous with my next offer. After Morrison rode away, Sam and Clara stood in silence for several minutes. Sam felt embarrassed about the mortgage revelation and uncertain about Clara's quick rejection of what might be their only chance to escape financial ruin. You should have told me about the debt before we married, Clara said finally. I know. I was afraid you'd change your mind about coming here. That was my decision to make, based on complete information. Clara's voice carried a note of reproach, but not anger. Marriage partnerships only work when both parties are honest about the challenges they face. We need to look at your financial records and figure out exactly where we stand. For the next 3 hours, Clara and Sam pored over account books, receipts, and bank statements spread across the kitchen table. Clara's mathematical skills impressed Sam. She could calculate complex figures in her head faster than he could work them out on paper.